So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night to all the participants. So we are all in very different time zones. I know for some of you, it would be a very, uh, I would say, inconvenient time to be have logged in, but uh, we cannot do much about it since it's a global event where we need to be looking at for each and every person's time zone. So welcome everyone, and we would be giving this presentation, uh, which would be basically to celebrate the Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And so first, I will just like to go ahead and tell you the agenda. So I would be presenting on the awareness on accessibility, and I will be followed by my colleague Jaunita, who would be giving a presentation on the introduction to accessibility development. Uh, so Jaunita is means for me, it has been a very curious talk that I had with her. She has a background in law, as well as she is a motivated coder. So she had been uh, into the accessibility domain for quite a long time, having been involved both with the development of WCAG standards as well as Area 1.2, all those things she had been involved with. And the presenter after that would be Dr. Angela Young. She is a senior accessibility consultant and advocate, and she has a lot of background on manual testing. So obviously, we all do a lot of testing using automated tools. But as we know that those tools are only able to cover up to a certain uh, number of accessibility issues, that is less than about 50% that we are able to cover. But she's a manual tester, so she would be able to give you an insight into how that manual testings take place. Uh, Now, this is something which accessibility people have been quite confused with access. Somehow, these two words are interchangeably used in the internet domain. And people do not realize that accessibility and access or ease of access are two different things. So, internet access or something is different. Accessibility is something which is quite different and is more related to people with disability. So someone with an impairment must be able to experience web-based services, content, and other digital products with the same success and outcome as an able-bodied person. So basically, what it says is that uh, irrespective of any disability or something, a person should be able to access the contents that we have on the internet or any digital content the same way that a abled person is able to access. And that is where we say that any digital content such as text table, because these are all types of contents that we have, hyperlinks, images, videos, should be reachable and navigatable by everyone, irrespective of the type of device or technology or location or education or disability or experience. So that is what the goal is for making everything 100% accessible. Uh, Different types of people with different impairments, like there could be a visual impairment person, a visually impaired person, or who may be completely 100% blind, or may have a low vision, or may have a color blindness, or a contrast sensitivity. Then there could be people with hearing impairments, motor disability, cognitive, and obviously less educated. Why I write that is because there are people who may not be able to uh, read, but they should be able to understand when somebody is speaking. A person may not be very fluent in a particular language, but if somebody is talking or that person is able to hear. He may not be able to read, but he is able to hear. So this also covers people with who are less educated. So coming back to the different types of digital devices that we have. So we have websites. Contents mostly flow in internet on websites. You have mailing and other systems, but website is the most common place that we have, where we have text, videos, audios, images, and there are forms to be filled up, or you have a chat box or a captcha. There could be some PDF or scanned documents that may be there. Then obviously television is another thing which is very popular media that people use for information. Phones, obviously. Then you have audio conferencing, video conferencing, webinar that like we are doing it today, and we have meetings and trainings, or it could be remote access. All these are only a few of the things that we use on the web or in the digital world. Now, coming back to how the ecosystem works on a web accessibility uh, concept. So there are different components that there are. I have broken this down into three verticals, if you I can say that, where your combined three of these components form the entire ecosystem of accessibility. So you have authoring tools, which is basically your content management system or the framework in which you have made a website. Uh, then the second portion is your content itself, which may be a text, it may be a video, it may be PDF document or a Word document, or it can just be an audio, it can be any of those things. And then the last, which is at the user end, is basically the user agent, which is basically the browser, any of the assistive technology tools that a person uses, or the device that he uses. So all those things come under the third category. So all these three categories combined together uh, give a person an experience of accessibility. Uh, as we all know that the web content accessibility guideline uh, has been there for us to be able to form some standards and see how accessible our contents are. And so this is just a small history of the last 1.5 decades that this standards have been in place. So it all started somewhere back in 1999 when WCAG 1 came into existence. And at that time, the most used component, because internet was still in its evolving phases at that time, and so HTML was the most common component or the element that was there on the internet to be accessed. So these guidelines were more focused and probably more related to the HTML. Uh, then, as the internet grew and the type of components with audios, videos, and you had Flash and all those things coming into play, uh, the standards WCAG2 came into existence in 2008 to cater to these new components that were there on the net, like PDFs or text documents, spreadsheets, presentations, ebooks, and obviously a small component of the mobile apps. Then in 2018, to further extend it uh, to a different category of persons with cognitive and learning disabilities and with other types of disabilities that people had, the WCAG 2.1 came into existence in 2018. And obviously, mobile phones were also quite being it was an initial phase for the mobile browsing, and all those things came into play, and this took into consideration, and that was something to WCAG 2.1 came into existence. Recently, very, very recently, WCAG 2.2 has been enforced, or I would say has come into existence, adapted by the W3C body. And that is where you have different, means whatever technologies have improved, and the different languages that we talk of today, the internationalized domain IDNs, the internationalized domain names, and all those languages that have we are talking about, universal acceptance and all those things. So that is something which has been covered into to an extent in the WCAG 2.2 standards, apart from some other augmentations that are there for that have been means some what you call experiences. Based on the experiences, some other components that were there in WCAG 2.1 have also been enhanced to a level. Uh, so now when we talk about these standards and the success criteria, see, it is not something that you just make a criteria or a standard. You have to look into whether it is viable. Accessibility obviously is a focus, but whether it is viable and whether it is technically feasible. So if you make something or a standard which is not viable or which is not technically feasible, it will never be implemented. So normally, what happens is when you are designing or you are incorporating, or probably these standards are being made, it is made in such a way that probably it should be technically feasible and viable. Viable in the sense is that it should not be, the cost should not be exorbitantly high, that people do not implement it or are reluctant to implement it. So technical feasibility and obviously business viability has to be there, apart from whatever accessibility you are incorporating into the standards. So that's a mix and match that happens, and that is how this. So if you see the yellow thing, which is basically an overlap of all the three, that's accessibility, viability, and feasibility. So when all these three things are there, then these standards are made and are more useful for being implemented. Now, WCAG has three different levels. So level A, level double A, and level triple A. So how does these levels have, means what is the meaning of these levels is that probably level A is the most basic of it. So that is something, if that is not implemented, that means the site is, or any of those contents or any of those digital content that we have is all inaccessible 100%. So these are some of the mandatory things that are there, that one should be able to have these for a site to be at least, I would not say it accessible, but in the direction of being accessible. Level double A obviously is something which is the requirement. So if it is being met, the standards in double A are being met, then the site is said to be reasonably accessible, and means probably it can be read by most types of disabled people. And obviously, AAA is something which is a higher standard and is desirable. In some cases, or some of the components people are able to implement. So it is left to the implementers to see the technical feasibility and the viability in the AAA standards, if they can implement it. So that's something which has been kept as an optional thing, and means some people do it and some people are not able to do it for different reasons. Core is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Anything that is there on the internet needs to be perceivable. So whatever we are doing today, anything that is there on the net, you need to be looking at that a person on the other side should be able to appreciate and understand what exactly you are means the content is all about. And then operable means that probably the navigations and other things that you do should be in such a way that it should not create any barrier or shortcomings for a person with some limitations to be able to use or browse the contents. Understandable, the text should be readable to the extent that the language that we use should be very, very simple, or so that a person with a low intellectual level should also be able to understand the contents. And robust should be that probably that's more related to the delivery of the content, that the content should be seamlessly delivered to the person using different technologies, the bandwidth, the efficiency, and all those things come into features of an accessible website. So screen reader usable. Any text that you have should be able to be readable by the screen reader. The content should be resizable. Uh, Now here what people say is that the resizable content, why do I need that? We can even have it on the browser, we can do a zoom and we should be able to use that. But if you do a zoom on a browser, the structure of the content of the website gets distorted. So that is not desirable. You will not be able to navigate or see things properly. So this is something which is something that the resize of the content or the text should be there as an embedded part, which does not affect the layout of the content that you have. Alternate text for images. So any image that you have should have a background text to it. So we should explain what that image is all about, so that when a person, a blind person, uses the screen reader, he cannot see that picture. So he can get the description of the picture read by the screen reader and know what exactly is that picture all about. Contrast and brightness there should be featured so that persons have uh, what you call an impairment where they cannot see a very high contrast. So you should have different contrast and brightness features so that the person can adjust according to his needs. Caption for audio. So a hearing impaired person needs to be able to get captions because he cannot hear the audio that is there. Links should be meaningful. I will come to these things in my subsequent slides, so I will just browse through these at this moment. Accessible with the keyboard, so a blind person cannot use a cursor or cannot see a cursor and a mouse, so the tab button, he should be able to navigate the entire contents. All text and content should be readable by the screen reader, like I said. Title of the website should be descriptive, so one person should be able to see what exactly is this website all about, and the input field should have labels. So all these things we'll have seen in the subsequent slides. I'm not explaining too much on at this stage. This is something which is the site should be, any content that you have should be responsive. So irrespective of the device or the browser, the site should be, the contents should be delivered in a seamless manner to every user that accesses it. The PDFs, why I've kept this slide is that there's a lot of features nowadays available in your even Word or in Acrobat, which can make the document accessible to an extent with their taggings and other things automatically. So a person does not need to be going into the coding or anything to do that. So that is something. In fact, while making this presentation, I discovered that the new PowerPoint also has a lot and lot of accessibility features. And not only that, it also is able to check and give you suggestions where you are missing on the accessibility of the PowerPoint presentation, and gives you suggestion how to improve that. So that's something which I found to be very interesting only this time when I've got a new version of Microsoft PowerPoint on my device, and I was making this presentation. So nowadays, a lot and lot of these softwares, keep in mind that whatever content you are developing on these softwares are accessible. The only thing is we should be motivated enough, or we should be conscious enough to be using those features and making contents accessible as much as possible. Coming back to the contrast, that is very, very important for people with what you call the blind, or people having visual impairment. Uh, the best contrast ratio we all know is black and white. We always talk about that, which is about 1:21, between the background and the foreground. But if you want to give an alternate contrast, then probably the best used or recommended setting is a yellow and a black, because yellow and black also gives you a contrast ratio of 19:1. So it is one of the best contrast ratios, which will also cater to anyone who is not able to see in very high contrast. So that's something which is the most recommended part. But you can use different contrast ratios. Like the lowest that you can use is 1:4.5. Below that, probably people will not be able to see it to the extent that you have. So if you see that low contrast text I have written on the top, and then it is, I think many of you may not be able to even read what is written after that, but it is low contrast text is bad for everyone. So that is something means we need to be making sure that probably the contrast that we give into a site on the foreground and background, it may be very jazzy or maybe very what you call colorful to us, but for a person with visual impairment, it may be a challenge. Uh, why I gave that yellow and black, yellow and black combination has, there are other combinations also that give you a very good contrast ratio. But yellow and black was chosen, or I would say yellow was chosen for the reason that if you see, there are different types of colorblind people. So out of all these spectrums that you see, the last spectrum, which is basically people with blue blindness or tritanopia, they are the only ones who do not have a vision on yellow spectrum. But that population is very, very small. That is 0.01%. So if we keep a yellow color, then at least you know that 99.99% people would be able to see it. So that's why the yellow color is supposed to be the most favorite color when you do a contrast to black and yellow and all those things. Coming to the forms and the fields, obviously these fields a visually blind person would not be able to see. So we need to have labels into it. So those labels are read by the screen reader, and the person knows that what he needs to be filling up. So labels are one of the most important part in a form for making it accessible. Uh, if you see this form, there is one more mistake in this form, which is basically the color. They have given a symbol which says that probably if there is an error, that symbol is shown. But the symbol's color and the error, if there's an error, if the field is outlined in the same color. So what happens if a person is having a blindness where he cannot see red color, then both symbol as well as the outline would not be visible to him. So probably one should try to make the outline and the symbol in different colors, keeping in mind that persons with different color blindness should be able to see that. Fewer colors you have, these will make things much better for visually impaired people. And so one should be not be making too much of a jazzy thing if he really wants his content to be accessible to all. Other method is to see that probably we have a textured thing. So even if the color, a person has a issue with some color, then also with the texture he is able to at least know that there is a difference and what exactly means. He is able to differentiate between the different patterns that you have, and able to identify what exactly these graphs and all make out. Uh, Now, these are some of the combinations which are not recommended. So I said 4.5 is to 1 is the contrast ratio. So based on these, many of these combinations do not qualify into it. Now, if you remember, we said core. So one of the components was that how we are able to make sure that the content is delivered in to the user in a very efficient manner. So for that, it is always recommended that when you are making content, the delivery should have follow the same order. Like the text should be coming first, the important ones, followed by the rest of the text. So even if he has a very poor bandwidth or a connectivity to the content, at least he would be able to grab the text and would be able to know or gather the information to a larger extent. That should be followed by the pictures and then the videos. So the heavier material goes to the least priority. So that is how that content delivery mechanism should be in place. Uh, Now, about the hyperlinks or anything that we do, uh, normally when you see an hyperlink, it is of a different color. So probably, like you see here, also we have a hyperlink going on to a digital world. But if a person is colorblind, he won't be able to discriminate between whether there is a hyperlink or there is normal text running. So it is always advisable that hyperlinks should be underlined so that they are under means discriminated or from the normal text, and people know that there is a hyperlink and they should be able to click it even if they are colorblind. Okay, just here. So the other thing is that probably when we make an hyperlink or a button to that extent, we should, in many cases, people just like click here. Now, for what purpose, you do not know, and where you are landing, you do not know. So the click here should not be used. You should use a description and make an hyperlink out of it, so a person knows what exactly he should expect when he clicks on that particular link. Some of the automated web accessibility tools. My colleague would be already talking about manual testing, but these are some of the professionally used paid tools that are there, and some of them are even free to an extent. These tools are available, and they give you an insight. If you run them on your website or something, they give you a decent insight into whether your contents are accessible or not. Up to at least 40 to 60% is the range that these means tools are able to capture. So it gives you a glimpse of the percentage, or probably I would say the readiness of your website to accessibility. Uh, Now, if you see, users with disability would be means the type of sites that are there today. Although we have been talking about accessibility for a very, very long time, I have been into this field for more than a decade and a half, and everyone has been talking about these things. We had those WCAG 1.0 standard that came in 1999. So it's been a long, long time that we have been talking about accessibility. But still, if you see the type means the sites or the content that is available, is still we are a long way to go from making those things really accessible. So these are some of the statistics that you see, which is from WebAIM. I've taken from their website that gives you the conformance of the contents and the websites, popular websites that are available on the web. And these are the common failure types. So low contrast, obviously, because people use different colors without realizing that probably the uh, contrast ratio needs to be maintained. So that's something that is there. Then missing alternate text for images is also a very high figure of 54.5. And here I would like to say that there may be alternate text for some of the images, but those, whether the text is a relevant text or not, is not covered by these automated tools. So maybe there's a picture of a road or maybe some monument. Whether the alternate text that is given for the description is really there, because I've seen in many of those cases, people just put some garbage out there without realizing that probably that is meant for a particular purpose and should be accurately readable by a screen reader for describing an image. So here also, if you see that 54.5, it may be a much higher figure if we consider uh, the relevance of the text. Then missing form input labels. So that's something of a very high figure, that is there of 48.6. Empty links. So you will find that many of those, there are broken links and other types of things that are there. Empty buttons, which again do not point anywhere, and missing document language. So in which language that document is, that is not there. So some of those screen readers would not be able to even identify uh, what exactly is the text all about, and they will not be able to read it. Uh, Again, the same thing, different languages. So we have statistics of the contents of different websites. So we have 50% which are in English. Obviously, that's something how that internet started with the English as its main language, followed by other languages. So we should be very sure that our content that we write, the your screen reader should be able to identify and read it properly. Uh, Now, some tips, although my colleagues would be taking more in depth on these on this topic, but just to give you some insight is that people means that's an experience I had, and I think many of you may be having is that people get their contents developed first, and then they give it to a tester or a testing agency to test it out. And then when they realize that the site or the contents are not accessible, they try to rework on that. So that's more work, and the thing doesn't come out so good, nicely doesn't come out. So one should consider the accessibility as at the first stage while designing or means probably what means the layout or the contents or the codes, anything, those that should be inbuilt as the first step, that yes, I need to be making things accessible. So that if it comes in the design part, probably half of your work is already done, and even the cost, there would be a cost saving for the reason that you won't be having to get many of those things redeveloped or corrected when you give it to an agency and you the report comes back to you. So the other thing is every user deserves a first-rate digital experience on the web. So no multiple versions of the website. There have been means examples where people say, I will make one website for the laptops and PCs, one for the mobile. There would be another site which would be only text for the screen reader. So that type of a thing should not be there. The whatever platform or website or content delivery mechanism you are using should uh, be a single one which should be able to have it developed accessible so that it can cater to all types of people. And that would obviously save you a lot of cost. Vocabulary should be plain and simple so that anyone should be able to understand. Uh, Language again, I have already said that the screen reader should be capable enough of reading the text that you have in different languages. So the language support is also a very important thing for a screen reader. And automated tools are something which would help you, but manual testing in the end is very, very important. Once you realize that your automatic tools is giving you a very high accuracy or of accessibility, say 100% or 99.9%, one should go with manual testing, and that is when you would be able to get into the finer details of the errors that he may and a user may be able would be facing, and identify that, and should be able to make those corrections to make the contents 100% accessible. Uh, this is something of resources on the W3 website. So this is just, if anyone is more interested, he can go on some of these resources and study them and use them in their development and other means when making a website. Uh, More on the tutorial. So again, these are some of the resources people can read. This is the if you our ASG document site or the wiki that we have. So probably if you want to know more about the accessibility standing group, you are most welcome to visit this page, and you will get a lot of documentation of the activities and other things that we have been doing, and all those records are there. So probably that would give you more insight into the working of the ISOC's accessibility standing group. This is something where I just kept one slide for this for the reason for there's a lot of buzzwords, and artificial intelligence is the talk of the town today. Obviously, as we move forward, artificial intelligence should be able to should be able to solve many of our accessibility issues to some extent. I would not say 100%, but obviously it should be a very great help in the near future for making our contents move towards a more accessible future. So that's all from my side. And if there are any questions or something, we will take in the end. I would leave the floor to my colleague Jaunita, who would be taking over from here and giving you an insight into developing accessible contents. Thank you very much. Jaunita, over to you.
Thank you so much. Really excited to be here today. And I am going to not start my video because I am over in Morocco and my Wi-Fi is not the most sure. I can't seem to share my, oh, I just got it. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to sorry, 1 second. I'm just getting my sharing ready. All right, so today we're going to be talking about coding for accessibility. And before I begin, I just wanted to point out some of the features in Zoom that you can use. You can actually change your view, first of all, so that you can better see the interpreters who are using international sign language. Also, there's closed captioning both in this presentation and a closed captioning feature under your menu at the bottom of the page. There are additional settings as well, including a focus mode under More, which is the ellipsis that follows all of the options on the lower menu of Zoom. And additionally, I just want to ask that folks do just hold off on sending messages in the chat because they can interfere with screen readers. Folks are using screen readers. So thank you so much. And my pronouns are she, her. So today we're going to talk about how the web works in general, and then we're going to go over a brief history of screen readers and screen reading technology, also the APIs that underlie screen reading technology. Then we're going to move into semantic HTML and how those get communicated to browsers, and then the accessibility APIs that exist on operating systems. Then we're going to go into ARIA and how that's tied into creating an accessible accessibility tree and an audio interface for users. Then we're going to go into CSS techniques, which can help with accessibility, as well as JavaScript techniques and backend techniques as well. So remember that accessible development is good development. As Praveen mentioned, it doesn't cost any extra if you develop a website accessibly from the beginning. And the thing is, it's far more robust. It's easier to maintain if you develop the site accessibly the first time. So there's a lot of additional benefits to accessible development. So let's just go over briefly how web browsers work. How do you see content on the web? So with web browsers, they help us find, information on the web, and information is received via the HTTP protocol. That's the reason why you have the prefix HTTP and now HTTPS before a actual link. And that's what you would input in the browser bar. Then the browser receives data from the server, and that information is rendered in HTML for the user, no matter which language it's written in. And then, CSS is compiled, and JS events and such are present and ready for the browser. So a brief history of where screen readers come from. IBM created the first screen reader. Jim Thatcher was working for them, and it was meant for DOS. So that was before graphical interfaces like Windows. And so later he continued working on that. It was mainly meant for blind and low vision employees at IBM. IBM actually hired their first blind employee in, I believe, 1916. Folks can fact check me there. It might have been 1899, actually. So they've always had a commitment to diversity, and they want to actually create a tool that would allow folks to use computers as they're becoming more popular in the 80s. And so Jim actually spent more time on screening technology and created a screen reader that's compatible with Windows and other graphical operating systems. Then JAWS also came onto the market. That was created in 1989 by two blind developers. Then you have NVDA, which is also one of the most popular screen readers in the world. There's JAWS, and then NVDA is almost as popular, and it's the only free one. It was created in 2006 by Michael Curran, who is also a blind developer, because of the fact that there were few tools on the market, few assistive technology tools that weren't free. That were free. So he wanted to create a free screen reader so that everybody could actually be able to use a computer without a cost barrier. Then Apple introduced VoiceOver in 2005 as part of its Mac OS operating system, and later they moved that to mobile. Android has TalkBack. So what is an accessibility API? An accessibility API actually is how the operating system communicates with assistive technology. It's essentially how it interprets the things that are both within the operating system itself, also on the web. And so browsers leverage that and actually communicate an accessibility tree to those APIs. And those are very closely related to the DOM tree. There isn't always a one-for-one translation, but it's very closely related. Now, on the right-hand side, I have two different images of how this works. One is of the first image from the Chromium documentation, just about how this works at a very, very basic level. The second diagram is a bit more complicated. So the first is for a static HTML page. So you have the DOM tree that communicates to the the browser uses to render the accessibility tree on the browser side. Then that's communicated to the operating system platform accessibility API. And then that's communicated to technology. Now, obviously, in modern web development, you have much more complex sites. A slightly more complex example is a site that uses a DOM tree that's augmented with the accessible rich Internet Application Spec, or ARIA, which actually extends HTML and provides more semantic features and such to communicate more information to assistive technologies. So you have CSS, which provides the design, and then you have the DOM tree augmented with ARIA, which then goes into the accessibility tree and the layout tree if you're talking about the actual design. And then those are communicated to platform accessibility APIs and then to assistive technology. So the core accessibility API mappings, I recommend every single person that works in this space to read that whole document and to actually look up the accessibility APIs. It is so important for understanding how accessibility works. And you do have screen reader APIs that are vendor specific as well, that are not available publicly. And but those only really extend what the core accessibility API mappings and what the operating system APIs currently do. The core AAM is actually is for ARIA, but it does cover things, a lot of these states and roles and such that exist in HTML as well. So there is, later we'll talk about ARIA in HTML and then how HTML is communicated to accessibility APIs. And there are a lot of similarities. So understanding the core accessibility API mappings will help you understand all of that. Then you should, I really recommend that you get into, the Microsoft and Apple APIs, API protocols, UI automation, and iAccessible2, and then MSAA, which was the first Microsoft API. iAccessible extends MSAA, and then you have UI automation as well, which is newer. And then the Mac OS Accessibility Protocol, there's a lot of documentation about that on Apple's website. There is also a lot of documentation about the accessibility protocol used on iOS. And then you have the Android Accessibility API as well, which communicates to things like TalkBack. Chromium, there is a ton of documentation about just how Chrome and very similar browsers such as Safari and Edge before it became a Chromium browser actually interpret accessibility APIs and the actual model in which it caches the page and such, and how that is communicated then through the to the platform accessibility APIs. So I recommend, it's a really great read. Really recommend looking at it and just getting familiar with all of that technical documentation, because once you understand that at a decent level, you can actually do a lot of just looking at the code and figuring out where the accessibility problems are, what are the missing attributes, what are the missing, if ARIA is actually needed, what types of progressive enhancement can be done on components to actually make them accessible. And you won't have to rely on screen reading technology to as much to actually perform an analysis. So it really kind of helps in a lot of different ways, because you'll understand how screen readers will actually interpret that content based off of the way the HTML is rendered in the CSS and such for the user through the browser. And also, by taking a look at the accessibility tree with DevTools. So accessibility APIs tend to work with, the accessibility tree. There's also events, which are generally managed by JavaScript, and actions. So those are requests from assistive technology for an interface to change. So that user activated things like somebody hitting their keyboard or what have you. So HTML is one of the main languages used on the web. It was developed by WHATWG and W3C, but now is maintained as a living standard by WHATWG. And I provide the link there, and I'll provide these slides to the leadership team so that they can distribute these, so you can have those links as well. And apologies in advance, the WHATWG site is one of the most inaccessible sites on the web, unfortunately, but it's also a site that many developers ought to use more often, because it actually does go into how to use HTML effectively, and what content's allowed and such, and how you get to well-structured content. So with each element within HTML, there's allowed and prohibited content. So those rules, most elements allow for either phrasing, flow content, or combination of both. There's also different other kinds of content that are allowed in certain elements, and those are also noted in the spec. So a document refers to the body tag, so that refers to the body of the web page, and then that is actually communicated to some screen readers as document. I believe Apple has a slightly different way of communicating that to users. I think it's more like web space. But the actual name escapes me. So flow content is actually block type content used within, so it's a number of different sentences or a number of different phrasing content items that are included in a container type element. So phrasing content are things like spans, which includes single like text nodes that would fit within a flow content node. Then I include here the HTML relationship to accessibility APIs. So the HTML AAM 1.0 is a working document, but a lot of the things it goes over do exist today on the web. And so I would take a look at this just to get more familiarity about what sorts of features are built into HTML and how browsers interpret HTML and communicate that to accessibility APIs. So with HTML, you have a thing called semantic markup. So those are kind of like the rules of the language, kind of like what we discussed earlier with the semantic HTML or with the HTML spec itself. HTML semantics provide meaning. You could do an entire website in HTML without providing any meaning, but really those semantic elements provide a grammar and structure so that it's completely understandable to your users. On the right-hand side, I have a diagram of a site with its appropriate markup, with just highlighting all the different elements that would belong to that site. So things like the header tag would be the first item within the DOM, and often the first item in the accessibility tree. You have a navigation. Typically, that would be your main menu of a site. And a side would be a side menu. Those are not present on all sites. All well-formed sites would have a main tag, and a main tag is where all of the website's content will live outside of the header and main navigation. Then you have other semantic elements that secure your content. It could be marked up in a number of ways. Text content as paragraphs, also denoted with a P, images in a figure tag, articles, which are standalone pieces, section, which is just a way to separate out different sections of the site that in a way that doesn't utilize landmarks. And of course, footer, which is a bit self-explanatory. It's the bottom part of the page, often with a lot of links and contact information and such. So there are many, many different types of tags, and not all of them are covered here in this diagram. So it's really important that developers understand the HTML semantics and use it and understand how to make well-formed pages, what things are allowed in these different elements, and what things would be prohibited. You can't nest certain elements, for example. So as part of that semantic diagram on the previous page, there were a few different elements that made up the actual structure of the site itself, aside from the content contained within the actual body. And those are called landmark tags. They're like the architecture of the site, the building in which the content is housed. So they're a way of identifying different sections on the web page. So things like the header, main content, which is where all the content lives, and the footer. They improve accessibility for your users because users using assistive technologies that have an audio interface, like a screen reader, can actually directly go to different landmarks on the page. So it just makes the content far more usable. Common semantic markup tags, besides ones that we've already discussed, include things like headings. So a lot of users are using screen reader technology. Will actually just skim all the headings on a page, and so they have to be appropriately nested and used in such a way where they provide a bit of an outline of the content. So think about it like you wrote a paper in school, and that paper often would include an outline, right? That outline, that structure of that paper itself, that essay you had to turn in, think of those pieces of that outline as your headings. Generally, what you want to do is you want to distill the content so that it makes sense to a user and has enough separation so that they can just skim the headings and get the gist of your content. That's similar to how a sighted person would just skim the text on a web page to get to where they want to go. Headings are very, very important in navigation. So paragraph tags, as I mentioned earlier, those are just blocks of texts. Each paragraph, when you put something in a paragraph tag, the next paragraph tag after it will actually add in a space. So it'll automatically give you a space. You don't need to use a line break. And the thing is, paragraph tags, the allowed content is both phrasing and flow content. So, things like links and spans and such can be included within a paragraph tag. Then you have links which allow users to navigate to new pages. It is inappropriate to use a link that executes JavaScript. That's a very common mistake I see with developers. They will have an href equals $, and it executes JavaScript and doesn't take somebody to a completely new page that has a new link within the browser bar. And that's an improper use of a link. At that point, the link is actually a button, and you should code it as a button. Buttons are used for interactions, and they often execute JavaScript. And so in a single page application, if the link doesn't change, I'd often tell people to just use a button instead of a link. Navigation provides a semantic container for navigation elements, which are often links, or sometimes they're buttons. So navigation shouldn't just be used by itself. Usually there's a list, an unordered list, or sometimes an ordered list in different cases. And the navigation would be wrapped around that, and links would be within each list item. And then you have things like an article tag, which is a piece of standalone content that can be used across pages. Those aren't used often correctly, but they do. You do see them quite a bit on the web. Section tags, they're supposed to be used to identify groups of related content. It's kind of the semantic version of a div. So important HTML attributes. So you have the tags, right? The tags contain attributes, and HTML attributes provide more functionality, more context to those different HTML elements, those different semantic tags we're talking about. Some key ones include alt text, or something with a role equals image. Alt text, an alt attribute can allow you to provide more information about that for folks using audio interface. ARIA labels can be used on interactive elements to provide a label for something, though I would use that with caution because they do override the label that's contained within text within the element itself. And I cited here the accessible name and description computation spec, which kind of outlines how that hierarchy works. And I really recommend that you all take a look and read that. Tab index is another one that's used quite frequently. It's an HTML attribute used to define the order in which elements are focused on a web page. Though web developers need to know that they cannot use anything but 0. Anything above 0 or below 0 would be considered an anti-pattern. It just creates a lot of problems and will ruin the experience for users. The role attribute is also very important, but it often gets overused, and it will override the role of any element it is used on. So if you have an input and you put role equals image, well, that input now becomes an image. So it's important to use those appropriately. The role attribute allows you to put in any of the ARIA roles that exist by browsers. And it's important to check to see if the roles or ARIA that you're using are supported before you use them, and which browsers are supported on, because not all browsers support all ARIA elements in the manner that you would expect. So what is ARIA? I've been talking a lot about it. The accessible rich in application stack is a set of attributes that can be used to extend and supplement HTML and provide that additional context for your users. Plus ARIA, you have an accessibility tree. It allows you to kind of perform surgery on that tree to kind of make it more meaningful for users. So if you have this really cool new widget that you just want your users to use, you can make it an ARIA and still provide users the same experience and that same sort of meaning if that functionality does not exist in HTML. It's a tool to give developers more ability to kind of make and create different kinds of web features. So when you use ARIA, the first rule of ARIA is don't use ARIA. But if you can't avoid it, it's first look to see if you have that feature available to you in HTML. There's a lot of benefits with using HTML that are not provided by ARIA. So try to build native HTML elements. If you're working on a complex functionality where there isn't quite an HTML element that will do that for you, do all you can in HTML and then progressively enhance by adding ARIA to cover the gaps. So let's talk a little bit about CSS. Cascading style sheets provide the layout and look and feel of a website. Separation allows for users to have a semantic experience in HTML, and then the CSS can be separated from that, allowing users to manipulate style sheets, add their own style sheets, and such to make this website more understandable for them. You want to make sure you're separating content from design so that users can use things like custom style sheets and such, which are used by folks with cognitive disabilities such as dyslexia, also folks who need different kinds of low vision support. There is an array of different custom styles that people might be using on your page. So, the best way to prepare for that is to have a separation of concerns and use CSS to host your CSS as its own, document, and not try to inline style your pages. Other accessibility considerations include, ensuring proper contrast, as Praveen mentioned, ensuring font size can be adjusted and that font size is appropriate. So you should always be using real text, not images of text, and you should always be modifying the style with CSS. Then layout is also important. It needs to be viewable on different devices. Users need to be able to manipulate it. Modern layout technologies do actually allow users to support increasing the text. So use relative sizing, for example, whenever you can, because that will allow the user to use the increased text feature within the browser, within user agents, so browsers and such, to increase the text itself, but not necessarily the whole page. So that allows for better reflow and such of the content. So there's also a number of accessibility considerations for JavaScript. For developers, often, with complex interactions, single-page applications, experiences on the web such as that, focus management techniques are really, really important. It's the most effective way to update users about what's been added or where they can find new content. So folks tend to use things like live regions and such. That's just not as good of a method as using a focus management technique to bring the user to the top of new content when it's dynamically updated on a page. Live regions, it's very difficult to control the queue. In screen readers, each screen reader creates its own queue. And because of the way browsers tend to cache sites and cache and serve up things to accessibility APIs, you can't really, as a content author, control queue and control when those live regions are going to get fired. The ARIA working group is working on a new spec that hopefully will address some of that, but we'll hopefully see that in the future. But right now, it's focus management techniques are really the way to go. So ARIA, as I mentioned earlier, just augments the accessibility trait. It actually provides no JavaScript value. All JavaScript value is provided through HTML. And you might be asking yourself, wait, I often make complex widgets with ARIA and tab index, right? Well, tab index is actually an HTML attribute. Anything in ARIA only provides semantic meaning. It does not do any, it does not provide functionality at all. As a developer, you're going to have to actually code that all by hand. And so that's another reason not to use ARIA. Is much more difficult to code, because in HTML gives you quite a bit of functionality, built right into those HTML elements. So then you have live regions and dynamic updates. As I mentioned earlier, live regions, I would avoid them if possible, but if you have to use them, they could be used in conjunction with JavaScript to inform users about changes to a page or just updates in general, where focused management techniques are not appropriate. So if you have, let's say, a counter that is continually updating like every 10 seconds to let the user know that their time is going to expire after a certain period, that might be better handled in a live region because you're changing just text content and it's not really a change to the website in any real way. Then you have backend accessibility. So a lot of people think that web accessibility is a front-end domain, and that is just not true. Backend engineers do a lot of work and a lot of front-end work, strangely, especially if they do work with like content management systems and such. So backend accessibility is actually, does exist, and it is something that backend engineers need to be aware of and a part of. So backend engineers can also create APIs, and those APIs should require certain attributes for important, types of content, such as images. When you have content served via the server side, so through a database to different users, so a page that supports multiple languages, for example. You'll want to make sure that those programmatic attributes are dynamically added into the content onto the front side, the side that the client sees. That's also an important consideration. There's also performance. So this is not only important to accessibility, but this is also important to a good portion of the web, of the world where the web is not fast. And so if you have content that is, slow to load, and the user and causes users with slow connections not to be able to use the website, that creates accessibility problems as well. Often what happens is that the site doesn't load fast enough for something like screen reading technology to actually be able to provide a full audio interface, or the screen reader will go faster than the interaction. So performance is actually very important to accessibility, but also just general usability. Then you have native mobile accessibility. So it's platform and language dependent. But many of the same web principles that apply to web also apply to mobile. We at W3C, they actually have a task force that is working on updating the mobile to ICT, the web to ICT guidance and such, which will provide new mobile guidance, but that's being updated. The mobile content accessibility guidelines developed by events in the meantime actually do provide a lot of decent guidance for mobile. There's also a number of samples in developer documentation for things like Google for Android and for iOS that developers can leverage to create accessible apps. So things like content descriptions and such attributes, and appropriate documentation about when to use those accessibility attributes are currently available on the developer sites for different mobile technologies. So then you have content authors who create the accessible content. So you want to make sure that you create content inclusively, and that just means that making sure that everybody can access and use it. So the best way to do that is to include a diverse group, including people with disabilities, in the content creation process. Meeting accessibility guidelines is another way to ensure that your content is accessible. That's not the only step. And then making it user-friendly. So be thoughtful about how you design and develop interfaces and make sure they're understandable as well as the content itself. So making content usable provides a lot of helpful information and guidance. I recommend everybody read it. It's really there's a lot of innovative and cutting edge advice and such that can really just help you and help make sure that your content is accessible to everybody. Also, writing alt text. Everybody knows that they have to include alt texts on informative images and infographics and such. Just make sure it's short, it's descriptive, writing good alt text is a bit of an art right now, though AI might be able to augment those capabilities in the future. So lots of exciting developments in that space are happening. There may be a way for users to hide and show different kinds of text alternatives and such that they may want to see. They may want more information about decorative images, for example, and things like computer vision and such can help augment that experience for users. So in conclusion, understanding how development impacts accessibility is key to helping build accessible experiences. And it's a lot to take in. I completely understand that there's a lot of very technical documentation and such that a person would have to read. There's a huge community on Slack and just out in the industry that's available to help you make sense of this. And if you ever need to reach out, you can always find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. I know that we're waiting till the end for questions. I can answer any questions in English et je peux répondre aux questions en français aussi. And that's it. And I'll pass it on to Dr. Young.
Thank you very much, Jaunita, and thank you everyone for the invitation to be here today. It's really a pleasure. My name is Dr. Angela Young, and my pronouns are they, them. Currently, I am serving with Navy Federal Credit Union as a contractor in their Training and Awareness Initiative program. So our goal is to train our employees and colleagues to understand why accessibility is so important so that we can then better serve our members. So I will share my screen, just a moment. So today we're going to be talking about the power of manual testing and why manual testing is such a vital, critical part of what we do for accessibility. So as you heard in the beginning, we did talk a little bit about that, we can use automated tools for testing, but today we're going to be going through some of the reasons why we would also want to consider manual testing in addition to what automated tools can provide. So the agenda for this talk, we're going to talk through the types of disabilities that we are specifically attempting to make digital experiences better for with manual testing. We're going to go through some manual testing basics, some practical steps and tools that you can utilize, and then benefits and how to manual test, and then also some tools and resources for you that are linked in these slides that at the conclusion of the presentation, I am sure that you're going to have this presentation. So there are links at the end where you can use some free resources that are available to you from different vendors. And then also, of course, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. So as I said, I'm Dr. Angela Young. My pronouns are they, them. I came to the accessibility industry with an 18-year background in education, and that has allowed me to understand the different ways we need to make learning better for students. And out of that passion for helping students and how they would learn, then it kind of transcended into how can we make the world more accessible for everyone. So right now I'm serving with Navy Federal Credit Union. And then when I'm not, doing my professional work during the day, I also really enjoy disability advocacy and speaking as well in situations kind of like this. So first, let's think about what it means to create an accessible experience. So when we consider creating accessible experiences for people with disabilities, we're mainly talking about people who have visual, hearing, motor, and cognitive disabilities. And those are the four main disability groups that when you're manually testing, if you attend to all of the different ways that people with those disabilities will be interacting with content, you're really getting the lion's share of making sure that your digital experiences are accessible for everybody. So let's talk through these types of disabilities as they relate to manual testing. So of course, when we're talking about a visual disability, we mean blindness or someone with low vision. Now, when you're thinking about testing considerations, you've heard the other presenters speak a little bit about color contrast and why that is important. And when you have a site or any kind of digital experience, you really do want to take care that the most pertinent, important information is something that is easily visible and easily definable from what else might be on the page. And that's where that color contrast really comes into play. Also, you want to think about the types of fonts that you're using because people with visual disabilities might have trouble distinguishing, especially if the fonts are really fancy or something different that you're not usually seeing, when you're on a digital website or an online experience. Then also we have people with hearing disabilities. So I myself am actually someone who is deaf, and hearing disabled people or hard of hearing people also, or people who are deaf, people can in this disability grouping can choose to identify any number of those ways. So for example, someone might not want to share that they're deaf. They might just want to say, oh, I'm hard of hearing. So there are medical definitions for each of those categories, and like when you're hard of hearing and how much hearing loss you have before you actually become what is considered clinically deaf. But anytime you're accounting for someone who might have a hearing issue or hearing deficit, you want to think about, your website, and if there is an audio component, are you using that audio component solely to relay information, or are you relaying information in other ways that are in addition to that audio component also? For people with motor disabilities, this affects movement and coordination. So for example, how are you allowing people to engage with your website and the different ways they would need to move around the site and all of the subsequent pages that you may have? So for example, if someone uses a mouse or a trackpad to move around a site, someone who has a motor disability might not be able to do that. They might need to use either spoken word and then having that word translate into a command on the computer, or they might need to use their keyboard for different commands, on the site. So how are you enabling your users to choose the way they want to utilize your website and to interact with your website? So basically making sure that when you're manually testing, you're considering all of the different ways that people with motor disabilities might want to use your website, and that your website still functions appropriately no matter how someone is choosing to use that. And then finally, cognitive disabilities. This includes learning disabilities such as ADHD or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and then other conditions that affect memory and understanding. So with regard to people with cognitive disabilities, you want to ensure that your website information is understandable. And that goes back to what we were talking about with perceivable. That's one of the ways that we ensure that we have an accessible experience for our users. So what we typically tend to say is that if you're including text and different features on your page that have some type of language component, you don't want to write any higher than what we would consider an 8th grade reading level or grade 8 reading level. So that is about a 12 or a 13-year-old child. So you would not want anything on your website that is more difficult for someone to understand. So, basically, there are different ways to test for the reading level on your website. And you can, utilize tools that you'll see at the end of this presentation, for example, to check the reading level of your website and to make sure that the language isn't so complex that someone with a cognitive disability might not have, the ability to understand the information that you're trying to convey. So what is manual testing? On the side here, there is an image that shows an example of manual testing. And what we see here is basically a website framework, and then we've put it through different tests on different browsers. So for the purposes of this image, for example, this person has tested the website on Firefox, Internet Explorer, and Chrome. And then they've noted the number of items that have passed the test. And then if there are any failures, they would also note that as well. So manual testing is the process of evaluating whatever digital product or website or component that you have by hand. And this is for the purpose of simulating the experience of what a real user would go through as they're navigating your website. Unlike automated testing, which relies on scripts and algorithms, manual testing is literally a human tester sitting there and manually going through every single website component to ensure that everything is functioning correctly. So there are a number of considerations when you're manual testing. You need to think about all of the different types of assistive technology that someone might be using to access your website. Now, of course, to be able to manually test for those conditions means that you need to have access and to become familiar with those assistive technology. So it's really important to note here that if you're not familiar with assistive technology such as keyboard shortcuts or a screen reader or NVDA or any other type of assistive technology such as a refreshable braille display, you might want to at least watch some YouTube videos, or if you have some of the access to some of these on your own devices, for example, like the screen reader, turn them on and start playing with them so that you understand how they function, because we don't know what we don't know, right? So if we're not familiar with how these things work, then we're not going to be able to serve other people who will be accessing our website, possibly using these devices. So why is manual testing important? It catches issues the automated tools can miss, and it also ensures a real-world usability. So basically, it ensures that when you're going in and you're looking at the different components of that website, you're doing it in a way that your clients might do it, just like the way they would. And you're thinking about all of the different perspectives that you could utilize to see the product from their perspective or from the perspective of a person with disabilities. And then also, it helps ensure that the content is meaningful and correctly interpreted by assistive technologies such as screen readers. So when you're manually testing, you're not just relying on what an automated tool is telling you. You're an imperfect human interacting with it as imperfect humans will. And then this can also shed some light on areas and considerations that you might not have thought of, upon initially creating your website. So by manually testing your product, you're more likely to create an inclusive and accessible experience for all users. This is a really critical step in the development process, and it also complements automated testing to provide a comprehensive approach to accessibility. So is automated testing great? Sure, of course it is. It'll give you a start, and some insight into what issues your site may be having for its users, but it's not the end all be all. You really want to make sure that you're going in, on the back end as a person sitting down in front of it, interacting with all of the components, and checking for anything that the automated testing might have missed. So what are the benefits? There are several benefits to manual testing. I put 3 here that are the main ones, but there are really a lot of different benefits. Number 1, it improves user experience by ensuring that your site is usable to everyone, including people with disabilities. Number 2, it helps ensure your site is compliant with legal accessibility standards in your area. And then number 3, it allows you to reach a wider audience. What's great about being accessible is that you're really accounting for the number of disabled humans that we have in the world. I mean, when you consider that, 20 to 25% of people can have a disability, that's a huge chunk of a user base that would not otherwise be able to access your website, had you not gone through this process and ensured that all accessibility features work correctly. So by broadening your user base, you're also really broadening the amount of customers that you can reach. And then you're also broadening, the amount of revenue that you can generate, for your business or your product or what have you, because you're not leaving people out. And that's really what manual testing is about. It's making sure that even though you've put your website through automated checks, you're really not leaving anyone out, and you've considered, all of the different angles that you can in providing a really awesome user experience. So when you're testing manually, you want to think about three main areas. Number one is keyboard navigation. Can a user access your website or your digital environment entirely through their keyboard? They should be able to do this. This is number one. Number two, does it have compatibility with a screen reader? So if a person chooses to turn on their screen reader on their device, their Windows device, their Mac device, or their mobile device, are they able to understand what's on your website, or is it really garbled and confusing? Are descriptions of things missing, so that then they would not be able to interact with all of the components. Number three is color contrast. You always want to ensure that your website has an appropriate level of color contrast, at the very minimum 5:1, and you want to make sure that anything on your website is distinguishable from one color to the next. And then secondly, also, that as other presenters have mentioned, that you're not entirely relying on color to convey a message, because that is really something that someone who has color blindness or other visual issues might really find problematic in their user experience. And then lastly, forms and input fields. You want to make sure that when someone is interacting with your website and they're giving information such as a username or a password or an address if they're having something shipped, or whatever it is that your website is trying to enable a client to do, you want to make sure they can do that within all of the forms and input fields that are on your site. So how do we perform manual testing? First thing is, I always start with the keyboard. Use the keyboard to navigate through the entire web page. You want to make sure that as you're going through with your keyboard, that each area of the website is lighting up appropriately and in an appropriate order. So when you turn on your keyboard shortcuts, when you turn on your keyboard accessibility and you're looking at the different ways that you can navigate a website through your keyboard, you should be seeing a box light up. It's usually in like a really bright green or a bright blue. Sometimes it's white or yellow. It just depends on what the components are on the site. And you can navigate through that web page, and you want to ensure that everything that the user needs to do can be done with the keyboard. So one example of a way that a site could fail manual testing in this way is if you're navigating a site with the keyboard and it hops over a really critical element or really critical information that someone on your site would need to be able to access. That would be a failure. Second is to use a screen reader to check the content and ensure that there are accurate audio descriptions of each area of your page. So now, you're off your keyboard, you're turning on your screen reader, and now you're going through it again with the screen reader turned on, and you're looking at each different component of your website. Third is to check color contrast with tools. If you don't have access to a color contrast analyzer already, WebAIM has a fantastic free resource where you can use the dropper tool and you can pick up a color and then you can check the color contrast. It'll also give you hex codes of appropriately contrasting colors if you need to find something alternative to use. And then when I look at a website, I'm looking at, how many different colors are used, how busy is the page. Because even if you've got color contrast and it's appropriate, you really want to think about how much information is on your page. Is it really overwhelming? And then number 4 would be test forms for accessibility, ensuring that they can be completed through both a keyboard input and voice to text audio input. Also, just a little pet peeve of mine. So a lot of people like to use GIFs and other different moving aspects on their website. And while these can be fun, they can also be really hindering for people who have cognitive disabilities or possibly a seizure disorder or something like that. So people say that you can use GIFs, sparingly, but I really would hope that you don't use them on a website anyway. Or if you do choose to use them, please, of course, if it's like within a very small, with a very small number of people, then know your audience by all means. But I would say that's definitely something, to stay away from. So we think of all these different elements that you can have on a website. You can have sound and you can have movement and you can have, text fading in and out or text moving, but all of those things are really inaccessible and they cause people with disabilities to become very frustrated. So just be mindful of that. And then also, along with that, I would say that, being accessible doesn't mean it has to be boring. So a lot of people think that, oh, if I make something accessible, it's going to be boring or people aren't going to find it, it interesting. But, there are so many ways to make accessible presentations that are really exciting and engaging, or accessible web pages that are really exciting and engaging. So if you're going to get started in manual testing, you really only need three things. You need a keyboard, you need a screen reader, you can either use NVDA or VoiceOver, there are some other ones out there, and then you also need some sort of color contrast analyzer. Now, of course, when you're getting into manual testing and you're doing a bit of a deeper dive, there are some other components, but for the purposes of this presentation as being more general, those are really the three things you need. And then, of course, I have included some resources here for you. So the W3C Web Accessibility Initiative has a lot of resources on manual testing. You can also look through their manuals for NVDA, how to use them. There's a manual for how to use VoiceOver I've included. DQ University offers free courses. Some of the courses are free, some you have to pay for, but they do have some free courses that give you some tools for ways to make digital environments more accessible. Google also offers accessibility developer tools. And then WebAIM, as I mentioned before, they have not only a color contrast analyzer, but they do have other tools that you could utilize for manual testing. Now, I will say, for the purposes of this presentation, this has really been a general overview for how to manually test and why it's important. Of course, if you're also wanting to consider how someone would interact with your website on a mobile device, there's a whole other, I guess, eggs in a basket, if you will, a whole other amount of components that you would need to consider, with regard to a mobile device and all of the different components you would need to test for a mobile device. Because as you know, different mobile devices act differently, and then they can also make your website act differently. So for the purposes of this presentation, this is just a general overview. But if you ever have any questions or you'd like to do a deeper dive into manual testing and why it's necessary, or even get an idea of how to begin manually testing and to get a routine down, as you manually test, I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have. And then lastly, I would say, manual testing isn't meant to be something, that we look at as, oh, it's an additional thing I have to do. This is going to take even more time. Because what's great about manual testing is, when you get yourself into your digital environment and you're looking at it from the perspective of a user, you might find things that are broken or that weren't coded properly that you can fix, before you even launch your website. And we always talk about how important it is to infuse accessibility into everything we do foundationally so that it's not becoming something we just tack on at the back end. So manual testing gives you a way to do that. It gives you ownership over everything you're putting out because you've checked it or had someone else check it, and made sure that everything you're putting out there on your digital environment makes sense. So in conclusion, manual testing is essential for ensuring digital accessibility. It catches issues the automated tools might miss, and it really does ensure that your product is truly usable by all. Manual testing also improves the user experience, and it helps ensure compliance with accessibility standards and legal requirements. And then ultimately, accessible design benefits everyone. And here's where we think about all of the different ways that somebody can be disabled. So as I'm sure you're aware, disability is an identity that any other identity can enter and exit out of at any given point. So for example, you can be a woman and be disabled. You can be religious and be disabled. You can be older, an older person, elderly, and be disabled. And there are so many different types of disabilities, and there are also so many different lengths of time that a person can be disabled. So you can be disabled situationally, which is very brief, such as if you're carrying bags of groceries and your arms are full and you can't use your arms at the moment. Or you can be disabled, more long term, such as someone who might need to use a wheelchair or walk with a prosthetic leg. So when you're considering accessibility, don't get pigeonholed into just thinking that it's only for people who have a genuine disability. It can be for anybody to utilize an accessibility feature at any point in time, to make their life easier and to make the way they interact with your web components easier. And by ensuring that your website is accessible, and that you have taken all those steps through manual testing, that really is how we create a more inclusive digital world. So I know we're saving questions for the end, but if you have any questions, I am more than happy to answer them for you. Also more than happy to connect with you. You can either email me or we can connect on LinkedIn. It would be my pleasure to talk more about what we've discussed today with you. Thank you again, and I very much appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Young, and thank you, Jaunita. I think the floor is now open if somebody has any questions. It was a very, I would say, in-depth and fruitful awareness about development as well as about manual testing. These presentations have given you a good insight, I hope. And so the floor is now open to any questions that you may be having. So I don't think we have any questions at this stage.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you so much, and we really appreciate this opportunity to speak with you today, especially on Global Accessibility Awareness Day.
Happy GAD, folks.
Yes, thank you all. I think it was a nice day, and probably I think the purpose was to make everyone aware about accessibility. And I hope that this webinar has given you a good insight into what accessibility is all about and how to go about making this world a truly inclusive, accessible world. So with that, I think we would, do we have, I think, okay. With that, I think I would like to thank everyone, and obviously my special thanks to Jolly, who had been very instrumental in organizing and webcasting this event live to everyone, and to my leadership team in the accessibility standing group, who have all contributed to make this awareness event successful today. Thank you all, and have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.